You should all be familiar now with how a bill becomes a law. You've watched the Schoolhouse Rocks video, "I'm Just a Bill," and you've had some practice looking at the various documents, bill text, congressional reports, hearings, floor debates, and statutes and codes, and you should be able to locate all those types of documents for your research. But how does that law take effect? In practical terms, how does a law become effective? The simple answer to that question is with rulemaking. Regulations. How is a regulation developed? Here's the process in a nutshell. Congress passes the law telling the executive to do something. The president has to enforce the law that Congress has passed, and the executive agencies will issue regulations to affect the law that Congress passed and the president has to enforce. So regulations begin with an action of the legislature. Now think of some of the executive agencies that you know. The FDA, the EPA, the FCC, these are regulatory agencies that were all created through legislation. This legislation is known as enabling legislation. Enabling legislation defines the scope of the agency's mission and enables it to perform its function, which may include promulgating regulations and adjudicating controversies. This is the definition from your textbook. We'll talk about adjudicating controversies later, but today we're going to focus on promulgating regulations. Now, this may seem obvious, but the agency cannot exceed the authority granted by the enabling legislation. For example, the FCC cannot create regulations concerning the labeling of drugs. This can become a sticky legal issue. A recent example, can the EPA regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants? The EPA says yes, it can, but many in Congress say that's an overreach of the EPA's authority, and the court just recently agreed with Congress. So you can bet that this is a question that will be decided with the help of lawyers trained in regulatory research. In implementing legislation, what is the regulatory agency bringing to the table? Why do we need the regulatory agency? First, expertise, scientific or technical. Congress passes the Clean Water Act. The EPA develops highly technical standards and issues regulations that set the total maximum daily load and the parts per million or parts per billion. But another reason is to define the scope of the legislation. For example, Congress passes the Family and Medical Leave Act. The Department of Labor issues regulations that define serious health condition. In developing regulations, the regulatory agency adheres to a set of rules. These are the rules for the rulemaking. Without going into too much detail, you should know that the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, is the most important of these rules. The APA governs the rulemaking process. In addition, there are several executive orders and pieces of other legislation that influence the regulatory process. So now that you have a broad overview, let's take a closer look at the process. The RegMap is a government publication that provides a detailed overview of the regulatory process. You can find this map at reginfo.gov, which is a good resource for any regulatory question. I would encourage you to download the map and to give it a good look. From a legal research perspective, the most important steps in the regulatory process are those that produce a document or legal word product. These are the material pieces of information that you'll be looking for when you're doing research. And other than legislation that starts the process of regulation, those pieces of legal info are produced at steps 5, 6, and 9. Let's take a closer look. Steps 1 through 4 are all preparatory steps in the rulemaking process. Notice that step 1, initiating events, is much more broad than we've discussed so far. We've focused on regulations that come from statutory mandates. But once an agency is created through enabling legislation, there are a variety of events that may initiate rulemaking. Notice also that there's a lengthy process of oversight and review before the proposed rule is made available to the public. At step 5, we have a tangible action. The initial rule is published in the Federal Register. The APA mandates that proposed rules be published in the Federal Register and that a period of public comment then follows. As a lawyer working in any area of regulatory law, this then is your first peek at forthcoming regulations. At the end of the comment period, the agency prepares a final rule, incorporating changes that have come out of the comment period, and if all goes according to plan, a final rule is then published. There may be other actions that take place. For example, sometimes the agency will decide it needs more information and solicit further comments. Or, if the agency is working under a tight deadline and the need for the regulations is timely, they may issue an interim final rule rather than a proposed rule. The interim final rule, as the name implies, is a rule that has the force of a final rule, while the details are still being worked out. So, a quick summary of the process. The agency is granted rulemaking authority from statute. The agency drafts proposed regulations, now or amending regulations, and publishes in the Federal Register, solicits comments. After the comment period, agency may scrap the proposed rule, extend the comment period, or publish a final rule. The final rule is published in the Federal Register. And finally, it's added to the Code of Federal Regulations according to publication schedule of the title where the rule belongs. Let's take a look now at the process in action. We've already mentioned the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. In this bill, Congress mandates that an employer allow an employee with a serious health condition to take unpaid medical leave. But what is a serious health condition? Defining this term falls to the regulatory agency, which in this case is the Department of Labor. The regulation from the Department of Labor has the force of law because it is enabled by the legislation, and by giving definition to the term, it affects the law. Let's trace the development of this regulation from the final bill to the final regulation. What we're most interested in here from a legal research perspective is what information is being produced in this process and where do we find it. First, there is that initiating event. In this case, the event is the passing of FMLA. This is the text of the original legislation. What you're looking at is the actual bill text of Public Law 103-3. In essence, this is the slip law. You could also find this in the United States Code or in the statutes at large. I found this online at congress.gov. And here we see a basic definition of serious health condition. After that initiating event, the agency in charge will put the matter on its regulatory agenda. This agency's regulatory agenda becomes part of the unified agenda. Now we'll talk more about the unified agenda another time, but let's take a look at this instance related to FMLA. This is the unified agenda from April of 1993. The agenda is published twice per year, once in the spring and once in the fall. Prior to 2007, the unified agenda was published in the Federal Register. Currently, it's published as its own document and made available electronically from a variety of government sources. And we see this is the Department of Labor. Two things to notice. The header, which lists pertinent information and the authority for the regulation, and the timetable for moving the regulation from proposal to final. In the case of FMLA, the scope of the legislation is broad enough that the Department of Labor wants to put some thought and solicit input before it issues a proposed rule. So we get a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM. This is published in the Federal Register. Next, we get an interim final rule and request for public comment. Normally, you would find a proposed rule. Why here is there an interim final rule instead? With FMLA, the legislation itself contained a timeline for implementation, so the Department of Labor is under a time constraint. The interim rule functions as a final rule until the final rules are established. At the end of the comment period, the Department of Labor decides to extend the comment period by 3 more months. And here you see the extension of that comment period. And finally, a final rule is issued. One important thing to highlight about the final rule is the preamble. In the preamble, the agency will discuss the process of developing the regs and respond to the public comments. This functions much like a legislative history of the regulations and can be an important part of your research. And here is the page that contains our definition of serious health condition. And the process is almost over, except for one last step. The new regulations are added to the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, one thing that you should notice about this entire process is that you need to understand the nature and use of the Federal Register and its big brother, the Code of Federal Regulations. And we're going to spend much of our time digging into these two sources and learning how to use them. There are a variety of sources and online platforms for the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations. On our Class MyLaw page, I've placed a document with links to these sources. Spend some time before class playing with some of them and come prepared to talk about your experience.